I'm Jim,
And I'm Garrett.
and this is
Jim
Jim
and
and Garrett
Garrett.
at the Movies. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of Jim and Garrett at the Movies. We are going to be reviewing the latest release from Robert Rodriguez, Alita Battle Angel. We'll also be pairing that with our movie club selection, Rollerball. Alita Battle Angel won the box office this week. Gained the top spot at the box office against its romantic comedy counterparts. It is directed, as I said, by Robert Rodriguez and has got a lot of big talent behind as producers, such as James Cameron and the like. And it stars Rosa Salazar, Christoph Waltz, Jennifer Connelly, Mahershala Ali, and several other great actors. It tells the story of Alita, who is a cyborg who is revived by scientists, sort of a Geppetto kind of character played by Christoph Waltz. She can't remember anything about her past life, but she knows that she is a hero going against the various factions in a post-apocalyptic future. So, before I go into what I thought about the film, Garrett, what about you? What did you think about this movie?
Well, I want to stick to my usual custom and say the things that I liked about it first. I thought the set design was really nice. I thought the sense of the world and the backdrop in which they were living felt really textured and really believable, recognizable, but also post-apocalyptic. And I thought the sound design was good. That's it. That's really about
and that's it. That's all you liked about it. Okay. I was waiting for the next if there was anything more in that list.
I'm sorry to say I was not impressed with the film.
Yeah, me neither. I thought the action scenes were well choreographed too. Some of those were visually delightful, and I think Robert Rodriguez has a great eye for action. So I enjoyed that part of that about it. But let's talk about this story, which is just about as fractured as one can get. This is definitely it has 4 credited check that 3 credited screenplay writers, and you can tell this is a hodgepodge of everybody's idea that got thrown into it with some of the worst dialogue that I've seen in quite some time. The actors do their best. You could sort of see Christoph Waltz saying, "I was just speaking Tarantino language the other day, and now I've got this. How do I do it?" The dialogue was awful. It was really tough to sit through some of these story elements, which by themselves could have made interesting movies, but there was just so much shoved in here that it was just a hodgepodge of nonsense. What did you think of the story?
Yeah, no, I more or less agree. I mean, I'm a fan of James Cameron's work in general. I felt that his last directorial film, Avatar, was visually beautiful, but the screenplay was rather terrible, and it was kind of surprising because I was under the impression, and I think his track record is just that James Cameron's a pretty damn good writer. But this is a second miss. Now again, maybe his version got altered by the people in post, but James Cameron being the producer on it too, he probably had last say over what went into the script. So yeah, the dialogue was just, there was so many lines that made me groan. I anticipated, don't say that, don't say that, don't say that. God damn it, they said that. It was just so awful and corny. I got the impression maybe halfway through that I just wasn't the target audience for this film. This maybe was a film that's sort of aimed at a younger female audience who don't really have enough role models, enough action heroes to look up to these days. And if that's what they were going for, more power to them. Maybe this isn't a film that I'm supposed to like. But at the same again, I was wanting to like it. I mean, I was sort of put off by the initial trailers, but I started hearing some good buzz, and I sort of went into it with a positive yet not overly optimistic attitude, and it failed to connect. Yeah, the storylines were clunky and forced. Things were, you mentioned the action sequences. I think it could have been easier for me to get along with the action sequences if I felt that they had been sort of more fundamentally grounded in the universe that had been created. But when Alita is in her first sort of bodily incarnation, she's using a body which by their own designation was designed for sort of civilian use, and somehow it has combat ready potential. I can buy that her brain is wired for combat because of reasons that are explained in the plot, but the body she's working with should not be able to go head to head with some of the toughest, baddest robots in the universe.
Right.
And again, that may seem nitpicky, and it kind of is, but it seems like that's the sort of thing which they could have fixed with some fairly simple changes to the story, in a way that would have made it more coherent. So yeah, it was just a mess, start to finish.
Well, I think that there are probably, I suspect that there are actually sort of four masters being served in this screenplay. We've got James Cameron writing it, Robert Rodriguez writing it, another writer. It's based upon an intellectual property. I believe it's a manga that this is based on. So it seems as though a lot of the clunky world building that happens in a lot of the expository dialogue in the first and second act of this film might be trying to pay homage to the original fan service, to the original, to the people who have a connection to this world and to this character. That said, it doesn't fully coalesce into a film. And I think that once we start contrasting it with Rollerball a little bit later, we're going to see what film does this poorly and what film does this well. Both of them are sort of post-apocalyptic films, but one does a lot more show and a lot less tell than Alita Battle Angel. Rollerball does a lot less show, or a lot less tell than Alita does. I did want to bring up something that I found interesting that I wish the film had explored more. To some degree, this is actually sort of me trying to tip my cap to this film, and it's dealing with some interesting themes about robotics and whether or not it's similar to the types of themes that AI, artificial intelligence, the Steven Spielberg, Stanley Kubrick hybrid movie that came out actually about 20 years ago, where the question becomes what makes a cyborg or a robotic person have all the rights and agency of a living being. And there are moments of this film that are sort of dipping its toes into these really interesting philosophical themes about what equates to a living and agent-driven being, and what equates to just like my Roomba. Not that I have a Roomba, but which is which? Like which is fully inanimate and which is animate and deserving of rights and agency. And I thought that this film could go there, especially in some of the sequences where Alita and other side characters play this sort of rollerball-esque game where they run around the track and kill each other. Whether or not we're supposed to view the death of those other cyborgs, as tragic, as murders, or whether we're meant to view them as the death of bad guys or just the death of my computer. So it was an interesting question that I thought the film left unexplored. But nevertheless, the fact that it's kind of playing with those themes, I think, is worthy of kind of a tip of a cap.
Yeah, I don't think they could have played with it given the way they set it up. I mean, at least the way they spell it out with Alita is that she has a fully human brain, which I think, for the purposes of this universe, is enough to say that she has, the sort of full moral agency and full moral status. And it's just, the mechanical parts of her that are robotic. And it's implied that that's the case for the rest of the robots too. So I don't really see the comparison to something like AI, which I do think handles that better. Instead, what my mind went to was a much less noble film and a much less artless film, and that was Elysium, the Matt Damon film from a few years back, which had the same city in the sky where the rich people live and the us poor schmucks are down here. And that was pretty crappy too. So it's again not a nice comparison in my mind.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate that Alita didn't do much for either of us on a story or character level. Anything else you want to say about it before we kind of wrap up here? This is
I
really
wanted
short. Or this is one of our shorter reviews because we're both like, yeah, no, fuck this movie.
Yeah, I wanted to somehow work out a joke about. I was glad to see the sequel to Big Eyes, and they brought Christoph Waltz back, but I don't know, I just couldn't quite make it work, so I'm just going to hang a lantern on it. Um,
That's fair.
so yeah, I mean like we were talking about last week with Toy Story, human faces are one of the hardest things to animate, and one of the things that just made this film stick out so terribly in terms of its special effects is that every time you're up close on Alita's face, she looks incredibly computer animated. But when you're looking at the other cyborgs, they have human faces on computer animated bodies, and they look much more plausible, much more believable. And so, like, I don't understand why you needed to computer animate her face. I realize you wanted the whole big eye effect, but I don't think you need that. I think Rosa Salazar would have looked fine as just herself with maybe just your standard sort of airbrushings or whatever to maybe give her an otherworldly look, but you did not need to computer animate that face. It was distracting. It was just badly done, and it made me much more critical of the other effects in the film, which otherwise I might have slid by. I mean, yes, you mentioned their what did they even call it? It wasn't rollerball. Was it motorball? Was that what it was? Right?
Yeah, it was something along those lines.
Yeah, I mean, those sequences, I mean, again, felt so much more artificial and forced to me. It lacked the concrete connection, the feeling of it being in a real place. It felt like an animated movie. And again, there's nothing wrong with an animated movie if it's an animated movie, but they were trying to sell it as making it look like this was real world, and those sequences felt just very, very mechanical.
Yeah.
And not in the way in which there's actual machines on the screen, but in the way in which they were produced. The images are produced by machines rather than by real things actually making contact with real things.
Yes, I totally agree with you. It wasn't as distracting as I thought it would be, but like when I first saw the trailer, I'm like, oh, this shit. So there were moments of the film where I was able to sort of forget that we were in this sort of what is it, uncanny valley visual effects. But yeah, there are definitely moments of this where I'm like, oh god, come on, please. So yeah, the visual effects it's kind of hit and miss for me.
Yeah, I suppose I should give some credit to Rosa Salazar, though. I think that she fleshed out the character well, given the limitations, both in terms of the dialogue, the writing, and working through all those special effects. I didn't so much like the character, but I did like the characterization, if that distinction makes sense, of Alita.
Yes, it does. So yeah, all right. What do we think about that? What did you give it out of 5?
Out of 5, I got to give it a 1.
A 1.
1.
Wow.
It's bad.
Yeah, it's not good. I was between 1.5 and 2, so I think you convinced me to 1. Why not? Or 1.5. I think there's enough. This is not. It's not total shit. It's not Happy Time Murders. So
I like the Happy Time Murders more than I like this.
Well, yeah, although that made like I remember your review of it where you're like, yeah, it's fine. And it's making like all of the worst of 2018 lists. So
and this is the thing, is that again, on its own merits, it might not be that bad of a film, but James Cameron and Robert Rodriguez are excellent filmmakers. Just their names alone set the bar fairly high for me. And so the expectation is partially what's letting me down here. I mean, I remember, I saw an interview with James Cameron, which he was talking about how the world was so expansive, and Robert Rodriguez was like a kid in a candy store and had all this stuff to play with. The world felt so incredibly small. Alita falls in love with the first boy that she meets. She walks out of her her new home and runs into one of the primary villains right away in the story, and it's like it's supposed to feel like a city, and it feels instead like a very 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 small neighborhood where you just happen to run into everybody everywhere you turn. And it felt that way because they needed to move the plot along, and they needed to bring the characters into play, and they were pressured to get for the time to make sense, and so they tried to make it an organic cross section of, oh, this character meets that character, and it makes sense, and it didn't. It felt forced, it felt small, and it felt petty. It's just I was really it's a disappointment more than anything else.
Well, I will tell you though, don't believe James Cameron because he's a hell of a hype man. He was the one who was telling us that Terminator Genesis was going to bring back the Terminator franchise. Okay, let's not. That was before the movie came out, so let's not say that James Cameron will do anything, will say anything to get you to buy his movie. So no recommends for Alita Battle Angel for Garrett, from Garrett and me. He's a little bit more down on the film than I am, although I am certainly down on the movie. Let's talk about a film that I am up on, Rollerball. This is a film that was not on my radar. This is the first time I've seen this film. It's 1975's Rollerball, directed by Norman Jewison, written by William Harrison, starring James Caan and the imperious John Houseman. This is the story of a sort of a jock character. James Caan plays kind of a jock character that James Caan plays, starring in a corporately run dystopian future where the game du jour is called Rollerball, a fatal game where men skate around in circles on roller skates, sort of a combination of boxing with spiked gloves and, I don't know, basketball. It's a satire. It's an action movie. It's a dystopian film. It takes its time with its characters, and it's got a lot going on in it. And so I want to kind of unpack some of the things that are happening in this film. Garrett, have you seen this movie before?
I have not. I mean, I'd heard a lot about it. I think I'd seen scenes from it here and there. And I recommended we pair it with this one because of the trailers for Alita had this sort of similar kind of future sport thing going on. But this is the first time I sat down and saw the whole thing. And yeah, I mean it didn't seem to surprise me so much because I'd heard generally positive things about it. I heard it came out I think 1 year before Logan's Run, which is it has many similarities with the dystopian science fiction 70s film, which is a film that I rather like. So it didn't quite surprise me as much as it seems to have surprised you, but I likewise share the generally positive sentiment. It's intelligent. It's saying something, again, in contrast to Alita, which at best is saying that young girls can kick ass, which is a good, fair enough thing to say, but simple,
I'll say that. Young girls can kick ass.
Young girls can kick ass. That's not a bad thing to say with a movie, but it's also kind of a simple thing to say with a movie. And whereas Rollerball is making much more clear commentary, on capitalism, on corporate society, on sports culture, on individualism, and so there's a lot of sociology going on in this movie, and it's not without its flaws, but generally I think it's carrying its weight pretty well.
Right. So let's unpack a lot of that. I mean, I think one of the key lines of this comes from the John Houseman character, Bartholomew, who says, corporate society is an inevitable destiny, a material dream world. Everything man touched became attainable. And I think that's where this film is sinking its satirical teeth into. It's trying to satirize corporate society and how much corporations sort of affect and determine our lives. And so the logical end of that is, what if cities were replaced with corporations? The logical end of that kind of idea is, what if corporations had the ability to determine not just how we live, but also whom we live with? At one point, James Caan's character's wife is taken away from him and assigned to another executive. And then, of course, he gets a replacement bride, one to whom he does not have as much of an emotional connection. So that satirical end of this film is something I really enjoyed, and I found quite interesting. There's also a lot of Huxley in this, a lot of Aldous Huxley, Brave New World. They're definitely cribbing from Huxley, as it. At one point, James Caan gives his new wife a pill, and what is it she has? It's pure aphrodisiac, which is exactly what's going on in Brave New World. They're just trying to keep the people totally enmeshed in this pleasure state in order for them to be more easily controlled. And this same type of thing is happening in many of the characters in this film as well. I want to keep going, but I also want to, give you a chance to respond to some of this stuff, because I'm about to bring up Noam Chomsky as well.
Well, yeah, I'm curious for the Chomsky lens on this, but yeah, and I think that again, there's some missed opportunities. Like you say, what if corporations replace cities? Well, they should have replaced cities. They shouldn't have been the Houston team and the New York team. It should have been, the energy, the Enron team or whatever. It should have been the corporations that are the cities. There shouldn't be a Houston. There should be an Enron. I think that would have taken that sort of progression that they were going for in a much more logical direction. I mean, they sort of say at the beginning about how sort of political entities and politics don't exist anymore. But cities are a politically designated region, so it kind of undercuts that message a little bit. So I feel they could have upped the ante by doing things like that a little bit better. Now, I suppose you could argue that might be a little too on the nose, a little too extreme. But for me, that I think would have accentuated the moral of the story more and upped the satire even further.
Sure, that's fair. I think at one point they do call it, like, the full name is Houston Energy rather than just Houston, but that's sort of a fair kind of criticism. Let me go into Chomsky for a little bit. There's one moment where there's one Chomsky quote where he's like, "When I was young and going to college, I wondered why I should care if the sports team, if my college sports team won. I didn't know anybody on the team. Why does this matter?" And what he's getting at is sort of these fake allegiances that sports creates for us, these fake tribes, in order to invest our emotion and our care and our energy and our intelligence. We invested in sports rather than investing it in political or social ills, as Chomsky might prefer us to do. And that this film kind of brought back those quotes for me as I was thinking about how the sport of rollerball exists in the society that this film creates. I thought that was fascinating how rollerball kind of played with that idea. And as a sports fan, as baseball as pitchers and catchers report to spring training at this point in the year, and I'm gearing up to root on my baseball team, I'm also realizing that I just watched a movie that was satirizing the fuck out of me, which I'm kind of okay with. Like, I'm okay with a film criticizing my own sort of sports allegiance. And how bloodthirsty all the audience members get, how bloodthirsty the characters and the players in these sports these games get. that is the type of sensationalism that we would attach ourselves to, rather than caring about, the fact that the 1% have all of the fucking money and are have all of the power. And that's a fascinating thing that this film is definitely playing with.
Yeah, the notion of bread and circuses, of course, is an old one, and I'm not really a sports fan in any sort of meaningful sense. But at the same time, and so I sort of on a personal level, I share Chomsky's sort of cynicism there, but on a more sort of intellectual and maybe intellectual sociological level, I'm not quite so cynical about sports. I mean, people have put forward the pet theory. I'm not sure if there's any actual sort of science behind this, but it's an interesting pet theory, if nothing else, that the purpose of organized sports is precisely to divest people from the need for warfare, right? The need for actual tribalism. You do this proxy fight on the playing field, and then you don't have to do the actual combat, the actual fight in the war field. Now, I mean, there's the promotional materials for Rollerball explicitly says this, right? It says like, in the future there is no war, but there is Rollerball. And so, there's this theme in a lot of dystopian science fiction about how we solve all of Earth's problems, but at the cost of sacrificing individualism or something like that.
Sure.
And that's, of course, a good theme to play with, and this theme plays with that well. But I think sort of too often we sort of we focus on the negative there. I mean, ending war is a goddamn good thing. If that's really what we've accomplished in this future of Rollerball. Like, I'm not saying it makes it a preferable place to live, but I think it kind of undercuts that cynicism from Chomsky. That sports are sort of a childish distraction from things that matter. No, sports, are, again, in this way of thinking, at least, is a way of avoiding one of the worst things. One of the things Chomsky is highly critical of, namely war. So,
sure. Well, yeah, but it's not just at the price of the individual. It's at the price. Like, there's still war going on in Rollerball. Like, some fools definitely die in this movie.
There's violence, but
there's tons of violence in the stands, in the rink itself. There's a lot of dead bodies by the end of this movie, and so I mean, just the fact that we're not bombing people and gassing them and doing all of the nasty things that we do in war, we're still, like, some people are still dying, and I don't. I think that I think that you're sort of downplaying the criticism against sports and against sports combat in a way that Rollerball. I think what you're saying is true about football. I don't think what you're saying is true about Rollerball. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think this is in some sense one of the other weaknesses of the film. And again, spoiler alerts for those of you who haven't seen it. Our movie club reviews include spoilers. For the first half of the film or so, it's a mystery as to why it is that the corporations are trying to push James Caan out. I mean, after all, he's top of his game, everyone loves to see him. Why on earth should he retire? He doesn't want to retire. And then sort of toward the end, we find out it's because his individual success was sort of reviving this notion of individualism that the corporations thought was hostile to the kind of world that they wanted to create. Which, again, philosophically, I think is a sort of interesting point, but narratively, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. They didn't. There's so many ways in which they could have taken James Caan out that didn't involve pressuring him to quit or even having him killed in action. There's a with the kind of resources that they have, there was easier ways in which they could have sidelined him. So it kind of was sort of weak narratively speaking that they needed to start upping the violence in the game in the hopes that maybe it'll kill this one guy. That's a little thin of a premise.
Yeah, it's the same premise that Alita Battle Angel uses at one.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Let's talk. Let's talk about the some of the things that this film does narratively. I think I might be a little higher on this movie than you are. One of the things this film does narratively well is show, not tell. There is no section where one character is explaining the rules of Rollerball to another character. we have an announcer. It's exposition by announcer. But even then, we mostly garner the idea of what the general rules of rollerball are just by watching a game.
There's a coaching scene where James Caan is coaching his teammates, but yeah, that doesn't really qualify. So
It's certainly not like Alita Battle Angel, where at one point a character explains the rules of the game to Alita.
yeah,
Um,
and the universe, like it's
and the universe.
the strong prey on the weak out here. Oh, you don't say. Really, it's a good thing you narratively informed us of this. That this is a cutthroat world. I never would have figured that out on my own.
Yeah, if you win the game, you get to go up there, and that's where all the rich people live. That's
Yeah.
right. That none of that happens in Rollerball. Well, very little of that happens in Rollerball. There's a lot of show not tell here, and even when the stakes of the game start raising, it's mostly displayed visually or through a few lines of dialogue, but nothing as direct as some of the more clunky dialogue that we saw in Alita. It was almost as though I watched bad Rollerball first. Actually, I saw Alita twice because the first time I fell asleep and I was like, "Oh fuck, I need to do a review for this film. I need to see it again." Oh god. I saw the bad version of Rollerball first, and then I saw the good version of Rollerball, the 1975 version. After I finished Alita, because everything that Alita did wrong, Rollerball did right. And maybe that's why I'm a little higher on the movie than perhaps I might normally would be. I recognize a lot of the problems that you have with it. Even James Caan's acting is a little off because his accent kind of disappears from scene to scene. But overall, I really like this movie. Is there anything else you want to say about it before we wrap it up?
Yeah, just I'm generally a fan of retrofuturism. It's always interesting to see how previous generations imagine the future to be, and the further back you go, the more sort of ostentatious the futurism becomes. And so the 70s is perhaps not quite as bad as it was in, like, say, the 50s, or even for that matter, the late 19th century. But at the same time, if you choose to pay attention to it, a lot of things like the fashion choices are quite laughable because they're so 70s. It's
Yes.
like again, I don't mean to rag on the costume designers specifically, because obviously they're working as a team and working with constraints, but it doesn't seem as though they put any imagination at all into thinking, okay, this is the future, so fashion choices are not going to look the same as ours. But yeah, they very much looked like there was like people look in 1975.
Mm-hmm.
You can maybe give, again, a little more leeway to the architecture because it's harder to create whole architectural sets for that sort of thing. But you figure at least the costuming could have been maybe a little bit more on point.
Yeah, there was one building in that film that looked like a mushroom.
Yeah. Yeah, and I kept trying to figure out, I don't know where they filmed it, but many of the scenes were set in Houston. I lived in Houston for 8 years. I kept looking around like, did I ever see that building? Was that something I recognized? And I can't say I recognized anything.
Giant mushroom building. You didn't visit?
There's some weird buildings in Houston, but that one at least I did not recall.
Yeah, it's I like this film quite a bit. I liked. There's the other thing that I need to talk about as well is how in the future all libraries are on the internet, and it reminded me of, well, not the internet, but on computers, and then the computers can go away and you would lose all of your history. And in fact, James Caan's character goes looking for information about the quote unquote corporate wars, and he runs into this sort of talking liquid that tells him, "No, I don't know anything about the things you're seeking." And I thought that was kind of an interesting, like it reminded me of some of our current issues about the death of physical media. And like, if we put corporations, this was something that we talked about vis-a-vis Filmstruck a few months ago. If we put corporations in charge of film history and we don't save physical media, then our access to it is going to be determined by our access to the internet and our access to other to corporate gatekeepers that we're not necessarily in control of. So I'm actually quite proud. I'm starting to get more and more proud of my physical media collection, and thinking about adding onto it a little bit more liberally than I currently do. I think that's there's so many things about this movie that are kind of prescient even in 1975 that they have something to say about 2019 as well. But
Agreed. And while I did not see, I think it was the 2002 remake. The word I hear is that it focused much more on the action and ignored the sort of the politics and the philosophy and the sociology, which is like just getting it all backwards as far as I'm
right,
concerned.
right. Yeah, I didn't see the 2002 remake either. I just heard bad things. So what do you give this out of 5, Garrett?
I give it 3.5.
I'm at 4. Yeah. I think I've been a half star ahead of you both for both films. So you're at 1. I'm 1.5 for Alita, and then 3.5 to 4 for Rollerball. So that's our discussion of Rollerball. We won't have a new segment this week, essentially because it's late, and it's 2:30 on the East Coast currently, and 1:30 where I am. So we won't have a new segment. We would have covered the Oscars and Oscar predictions. I will be doing my Oscar coverage for local news, WEHT, WTVW, and posting those videos to my Twitter account. So if you want to know my Oscar predictions, Roma, then I will. You will see all of those on my Twitter account and on WEHT WTVW. Next week, we will be reacting to the Oscars, which will happen on Sunday. Next Tuesday, we will be talking about the Oscars. We'll also be reviewing How to Train Your Dragon 3, or as it's being released, How to Train Your Dragon: The Hidden World. We'll be pairing that with Big Hero 6, a nice, solid animated film, and talking about the Oscars. So until then, I'm Jim.
And I'm Garrett.
And this is
Jim and Garrett
Movies. Good night.